Good day, Britain. You know your government has spectacularly failed at basic due diligence when they are publicly celebrating the return of someone they fought to free from Egyptian detention, only to discover hours later that his posted messages calling for killing Zionists, denying the Holocaust, advocating murdering police, and branding Britain's dogs and monkeys. The Conservatives are now demanding that Alaa El-Fattah, the Egyptian-British activist whose release Keir Starmer was delighted about and which David Lammy and Yvette Cooper called a top priority, be stripped of his citizenship and deported after a string of xenophobic and anti-Semitic posts came to light on social media. Tory leader Keir is demanding citizenship revocation, while Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick says El-Fattah should be made to live in Egypt or frankly anywhere else in the world and never should have been granted British citizenship in the first place, even though that happened under Conservative government in 2021. This is a story of how Labour's government fought for years to free someone without apparently checking his social media history, how Starmer was forced to row back from his delighted welcome after discovering messages like, "I consider killing any colonialist and especially Zionist heroic," and why this catastrophic failure of vetting reveals everything about how progressive ideology can blind governments to obvious red flags when someone is positioned as a political prisoner or human rights cause. Quick favor before we explore this monumental vetting failure. If you're stunned that a government would campaign for someone's release without checking their social media first, hit that subscribe button right now. Over 94% of you watching haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes a second, and helps us keep exposing politicians who prioritize ideology over basic due diligence. Smash that notification bell so you never miss when we document the next government embarrassment or security failure. If you've just subscribed, you're brilliant. Cheers. Now, let's dissect how Labour welcomed back someone who advocated killing Zionists and police. Let's start with a timeline because it's crucial for understanding just how embarrassing this is for the government. Alaa El-Fattah served more than a decade of nearly continuous detention in Egyptian jails before his release in September 2025. He flew back to London on Friday after a previous attempt to leave Egypt in November was blocked by security forces. His release had been a long-standing priority under successive governments, with considerable political capital expended campaigning for his freedom. David Lammy and Yvette Cooper specifically welcomed his arrival, calling his release a top priority for our government. Keir Starmer said he was delighted by El-Fattah's return to Britain. All of this happened before anyone apparently thought to thoroughly review his social media history. Then, as his family celebrated his return to the UK, evidence of El-Fattah's historic social media posts emerged, and they're absolutely shocking. We're not talking about mildly controversial opinions or edgy humor. We're talking about messages explicitly calling for killing Zionists and police, denying the Holocaust, and using dehumanizing language about British people. His posts included statements like, "I consider killing any colonialist and especially Zionists heroic. We need to kill more of them, and there was no genocide against Jews by the Nazis. After all, many Jews are left." Think about that for a moment. The British government campaigned for years to free someone who posted Holocaust denial on social media. That's not just embarrassing, that's potentially dangerous given current levels of antisemitism and the recent Bondi Beach massacre. Keir Starmer was left red-faced today, according to reports, after he said he was unaware of the abhorrent social media history when he welcomed El-Fattah back to Britain. The Prime Minister was forced to row back from his earlier comments in which he sparked backlash for saying he was delighted by the return. Think about what this reveals. Either Starmer and his government didn't bother checking El-Fattah's social media before campaigning for his release and welcoming him back, which suggests incompetence and lack of due diligence, or they knew about these posts and didn't think they were disqualifying, which suggests terrible judgment about what constitutes unacceptable extremism. The Foreign Office released a statement today attempting damage control. The government condemns Mr. El-Fattah's historic tweets and considers them to be abhorrent. That statement was added to an earlier one that read, "Mr. El-Fattah is a British citizen. It has been a long-standing priority under successive governments to work for his release from detention and to see him reunited with his family in the UK." Notice the framing. They are trying to distance themselves from his views whilst defending their actions by noting it's been a priority under successive governments, essentially spreading blame across multiple administrations, including Conservative ones. Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick's response has been unequivocal. He told the BBC that El-Fattah should be made to live in Egypt or frankly anywhere else in the world. Jenrick called on Labour to rectify this situation by being clear that they distance themselves and our country wholeheartedly from his views and begin proceedings to revoke his citizenship and have him removed from the UK. Writing in the Mail on Sunday, Jenrick said, "At a time when anti-Semitic incidents are surging, when Jewish communities feel under threat and when policing is under intense pressure, the signal this sends is grotesque." That's the key point. The timing could hardly be worse. Just weeks after the Bondi Beach massacre targeted Jewish Australians during Hanukkah, whilst anti-Semitic attacks are increasing in Britain, the government is welcoming back someone who's posted messages calling for killing Zionists. The optics are catastrophic. Jenrick also made the important point that the Prime Minister is no longer a private campaigner or gun for hire. His words carry weight and represent us all. This references Starmer's background as human rights lawyer who often represented controversial clients and causes. That's fine for a private lawyer whose job is advocating for clients regardless of personal views. But as Prime Minister, Starmer represents Britain, and his public delight at welcoming someone with this social media history sends terrible messages about what the government considers acceptable. Reform leader Nigel Farage's response was characteristically blunt. This government just gets worse. No mention of these violent tweets on the BBC News story either. That last point about BBC coverage is interesting because it raises questions about whether media outlets were initially downplaying or ignoring the social media history whilst focusing on the human rights angle of someone released from Egyptian detention. The Border Security Commander Martin Hewitt's comment that the number of arrivals is frustrating, but that stopping the smuggling route was always going to take time is exactly the kind of excuse-making that drives voters mad. How much time? How many more years? How many more tens of thousands of illegal arrivals before we see actual results? Labour has been in power for 18 months. They had time to implement policies, establish enforcement priorities, allocate resources, and the numbers are worse than ever. At what point does this takes time become an admission of failure rather than a request for patience? The Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Act that became law in December introduces new criminal offenses and counter-terror-style powers to crack down on smuggling gangs. That sounds impressive until you realize that we already had laws against people smuggling. We already had enforcement powers. The problem has never been lack of legal authority. The problem is lack of political will to use the authority we have, lack of resources devoted to enforcement, and most fundamentally, lack of an effective deterrent that makes crossing the channel in small boats an unattractive option for migrants. Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood's November announcement of the most significant changes to our asylum system in modern times also deserves scrutiny. The reforms, inspired by Denmark's system, would make refugee status temporary with reviews every 30 months, and refugees would wait 20 years for permanent settlement instead of 5. That's genuinely tougher than current policy, and it sparked backlash from Labour MPs who called it shameful and accused the government of echoing Farage's rhetoric. But here's the thing, those reforms haven't been introduced in legislation yet. They are just announcements, promises of future action. And even if implemented, they don't address the fundamental problem of people arriving illegally in the first place. The criticism from Labour MPs that these reforms echo Reform UK is also revealing. It shows that Labour is internally divided on immigration, with the progressive wing viewing any enforcement or restriction as right-wing and shameful, whilst the government tries to appear tough to voters who elected them partially on promises to control immigration. That internal tension makes coherent policy impossible. You end up with rhetoric that sounds tough to reassure voters, combined with implementation that's weak because your own backbenchers rebel against anything genuinely restrictive. Conservative leader Keir Badenoch's argument that these measures don't go far enough and that leaving the European Convention on Human Rights is necessary represents a tougher end of the political spectrum. Both Conservatives and Reform UK want to quit the ECHR, viewing it as a fundamental obstacle preventing effective immigration control. Labour insists they won't leave but will seek to adjust how immigration cases are interpreted in UK law, which sounds like having your cake and eating it too. You can't remain bound by a treaty whilst interpreting it so differently that you're effectively ignoring it. Either the ECHR constraints matter or they don't. Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy meeting ECHR member states to discuss reforming the treaty to address illegal migration is theatre. The ECHR is not going to fundamentally change its human rights protections because Britain is frustrated with immigration consequences. Other member states don't share Britain's small boat problem to the same degree and have no incentive to weaken human rights protections that they value. This diplomatic outreach will produce nothing of substance whilst allowing Labour to claim they're exploring all options short of actually leaving the treaty. Now let's talk about the one-in, one-out returns deal with France that Farage calls a farce. Under this pilot scheme, people arriving in the UK by small boat can be detained and returned to France in exchange for an equivalent number coming through safe and legal routes. As of mid-December, 193 migrants had been sent back to France and 195 had arrived under the deal. So it's basically a one-to-one exchange with no net reduction in numbers. Worse, there have been cases of migrants being returned to France under the deal, then crossing again and being caught, requiring a second deportation. How exactly is that a deterrent? The scheme's fundamental flaw is obvious. If you get caught crossing illegally, the worst that happens is you're sent back to France, from where you can simply try again. And in exchange for accepting returns, France gets to send equivalent numbers to the UK through official channels. So Britain isn't reducing overall immigration, it's just shuffling people between categories whilst creating the appearance of enforcement. This is what Farage means by calling it a farce. Its immigration policy is theatre rather than substance. The human cost of this policy failure is also worth noting. At least 17 people died attempting the journey last year according to French and UK authorities, though there's no official record of channel fatalities. The International Organization for Migration reports possibly 36 deaths linked to attempts to reach the UK from mainland Europe. These deaths are tragic and preventable.